Hi everyone, welcome to video 3 of our 6-video series in the Customer Satisfaction Survey Toolkit. Funded by Community Sector Banking through the 2019 Social Investment Grants Program and in partnership with the New South Wales Council of Social Service, Survey Matters have produced this series of short, educational videos to help NGOs understand best practice when conducting customer satisfaction surveys. You will have seen this picture in the first video, and it provides an overview of the series. In this third video, we'll provide a practical explanation of how to design a survey questionnaire, and then how to program the survey in your software tool. Now, just as a warning, this is probably the longest video in the series. However, questionnaire design really is the most important aspect of conducting a survey, so it's worth persevering through this one if you can. There are several steps you need to go through to design your survey questionnaire. Firstly, you need to decide on the type of survey that you're running. Is it a customer satisfaction survey, a volunteer feedback survey, or a program evaluation? Once you have done this, you can start writing your questionnaire. There are some important things to remember, such as question order, type, rating scales, and survey length. Next, if you're conducting the survey online, you need to choose the most appropriate software. And finally, once you've done that, you load your questions into the software and then test it to make sure that it all works. So the first thing to do before building a questionnaire is to think about your survey design. And there are two main types of survey that you can choose from. The first is a once-off survey, and this is information collected at a single point in time. Typically surveys a group of people from a larger population to gather opinions about one particular situation at a time. This might include, for example, a survey about participation in a one-off event or service. The second type of survey is a tracking survey, and this is a survey that collects information over a longer period of time or at different time points. Tracking surveys help us look at trends over time. They are typically used to look at changes year on year to improve service levels. When conducting a tracking survey, it's really essential to have continuity, and by that what I mean is that you need to keep your key questions and measures the same from one point in time to another. This is the only way that you can make consistent comparisons over time. There are obviously many different types of surveys you can conduct, and we've put together some survey templates for those surveys that are commonly used by community service organisations. This way you can see how the questions vary and the specific structure that might be a good idea to use. We recommend that you use these templates for your own survey, or at least as a good starting point to build a custom survey based on your specific objectives. The surveys that we've designed and that are included in the Customer Satisfaction Toolkit are listed on the screen. After you've decided on the type and frequency of the survey you're conducting, you're then able to move on and start actually writing your questionnaire. The most important thing here is to make sure that your questionnaire answers your key research questions. So I can't stress enough how important it is that you keep these research questions and your objectives in mind as you go through and write your questionnaire. In summary, there are 5 steps involved when you design a questionnaire. Firstly, you need to think about your question order. You need to craft your question wording very carefully. Consider the type of question that you're asking. Think about the rating scales that are most appropriate. And then finally, once it's written, you assess your survey length. So we'll talk through each of these steps in detail to give you an idea of what I mean. When writing survey questions, it might seem pretty straightforward. However, there are a number of things that I think it's really important for you to think about before you begin. And the first and most important really is the question order. The order that your questions appear in your survey can have a big impact on the responses you collect. Questionnaires should follow a logical order because grouping similar questions together makes the questionnaire easier to complete for your respondents. A way to ensure that you're following a logical survey order is to use the funnel technique. And this technique starts with asking your broad questions first, places the most difficult questions in the middle, and ends with those easy to answer personal questions. What we'll do is we'll walk through an example that puts that funnel technique to use in a questionnaire. What we're going to do is use the volunteer satisfaction survey for this example. And this is one of the template questionnaires that are provided if you'd like to have a look at the full version. In all surveys, it's really good practice to start with an introduction. This informs your participants about the purpose of your survey and how results will be used. It's important to outline here that the responses are confidential and that the privacy of your participants will be protected. You also need to make sure that you provide contact details in case anyone has some concerns about the nature of the project. Once you've put your introduction together, you can look at applying the funnel technique, and you start with your broad overarching questions first. As you can see by the example we've got here, we start at a very high level to test overall satisfaction with volunteering. We don't go into any of the specific aspects of the experience yet. You might also ask for some general feedback about the most rewarding aspects of your volunteering experience. And again, this is quite high level because it allows the participant to provide feedback about their experience. And we normally do that at the beginning to give participants a chance to provide what we refer to as their top of mind feedback before we've reminded them about various aspects of the volunteering experience. We then move into the middle section after you've got that top of mind feedback, and that addresses the more difficult questions we'd like to have answered. In this example that we've got up here, we move on to ask the participants about how they feel about specific elements of the volunteering experience. And as you can see, we've got some examples here that asks about the specific experience at work, their relationships with management, the recognition they receive. You might also add some questions to explore the training that was provided and what impact that had on their experience. The middle section might also explore ways of improving the experience, and we can use this to identify some strengths and weaknesses and seek ideas for improvements to the volunteering experience. This might include some open-end questions that ask for participants to provide their ideas in their own words, but it could also be a question that asks them to select from a list of options of things that you might be considering doing to make changes to improve volunteering in your organisation. When you put these sorts of lists together, we sort of recommend that you don't have too many options there because that can get a bit overwhelming. Just try and keep your statements clear and avoid overlapping statements. The final part of the funnel technique is asking those broad, really easy to answer questions. These take less time, less mental load than other questions, as the answers are really just well known to participants and it's simply a matter of clicking the correct option. It's usually quite straightforward and includes basic demographic details about the individuals, such as their age and gender. You might also ask about things like how long they've been volunteering with your organisation, what location, where they live. One tip that I'd probably add here is try to only include those demographics or only ask those questions that you plan on using in your data analysis. It really is good practice not to collect more personal information that you need. We'll go into this in more detail in video 6 when we talk about privacy, but it is something worth remembering. So once you've thought about your overall survey order and have a broad questionnaire plan, you can start actually writing or crafting the survey questions in detail. And when you do this, there's just a few rules or good practice things that you should follow. Firstly, and probably the most important thing, and I can't stress this enough, is really make sure you're only asking one question at a time. So for example, that we've got up here, we ask in good practice, how satisfied you are volunteering for the organisation. This only asks about one question, are they satisfied with volunteering? The other question we have up there is, how satisfied were you with your experience volunteering and training? Now that's asking about two things. It's asking about volunteering and training. So when your respondent answers, you will have no way of knowing whether they were answering about volunteering or training. And so really the data you collect there doesn't become much use to you. Secondly, the next thing to think about is to ensure that the person you're asking the question of is able to answer it. There's no point asking, for example, your donors a question about volunteering. It's not relevant to them and they won't be able to answer. You really need to make sure that your audience is able to provide the information you're asking for. Thirdly, I'd really encourage you to use clear and simple language. While this might seem like common sense, make sure you get your question across quickly. You risk overburdening and irritating respondents if your questions are too complicated. This potentially leads to incorrect answers, or it can also lead to high dropout rates where people just abandon because they can't be bothered thinking through what the question is asking them. Finally, another really important thing to keep in mind is don't lead people to answer in a certain way. For example, we've got a question up there that suggests, were you provided with training for your volunteering role? And that's a very simple yes or no. You were or you weren't provided with the training. However, if you ask, were you provided with excellent training for your volunteering? The word excellent leads the respondent to think that the training may be well regarded in the industry and is of high standard, making them more likely to agree. You also don't know if they say that they weren't provided with excellent training, whether they didn't receive any training or whether they didn't think it was excellent training. So it just leads to a little bit of ambiguity in the responses that you receive. Another thing to consider is the type of question you're asking. And questions generally fall into three main categories of questions, and I'll just step through them. There are more than this, but these are probably the main ones that you'll use. The first one is a multi-response question. And just as the name suggests, this allows the respondent to select multiple answers from your option list. There's an example up on the screen there, and you try and keep the option list not too long, but also try not to allow respondents to select more than 3 answers or more than 3 options. It just makes it very difficult to tell where the preferences lie. The second type of question is a single response question, and this allows respondents to select one answer only. This is generally associated with yes/no questions, rating scales like agree to disagree, or questions that have distinct categories, for example, gender or age. Usually you can tell with a single response question that there really is only one unique answer that can be provided. And the last type that we've got here is an open-end question, and this allows respondents to type in an answer in their own words. This question type is useful when you would like to know more about a question or when you'd like to know respondents' top of mind thoughts. And I'd really recommend including a couple of these in your quantitative surveys because they do provide that little bit of extra depth of information and give you a little bit more of a story to tell. The next thing that you would think about is the rating scales. And they're one of the most common techniques in surveys, and they're used to measure things like agreement or satisfaction. Rating scales can generally be a 10, a 7 or a 5-point scale, depending on the level of detail you need within your responses. While we would often use a 7-point scale for more complex surveys, if you're conducting your own survey, we'd probably recommend using a 5-point scale, just because these are easy for respondents to interpret and they're also easier to analyse from a data perspective. And as you can see from this example here, we've got 7 and 5-point rating scales, and you can just see that the 7-point offers more granularity in terms of the responses, while the 5-point's just a bit more user-friendly and easier to understand. So we've just got some different examples up here about how the 5-point rating scales might be used. And as you can see, we've got them here for satisfaction, for likelihood to do something, and for agreement. Just a tip here, I think, is really just important if you've got a scenario where you're uncertain about whether a respondent can answer the question, it's always better to include a don't know option like we have down here for the likelihood measure. Another way that you might use rating scales is for those attitudinal or outcome measures that we might put several statements within what we call a matrix question. And there's some examples up there. When adding these scales to your questionnaire, it's always just important to make sure that you order your scale from negative to positive when working from left to right. It's also really important that you include a balanced and equal number of both positive and negative statements. This prevents bias in your results. For example, if you were to offer 4 positive options and only 1 negative, you're much more likely to get a positive result. Finally, once you have written your survey and got your rating scales done, you just need to assess the length of your survey. It's really common for us to be asked, how long should my questionnaire be? Now, given every questionnaire is different, there's not really one single answer. However, we've sort of done some research, and as a guide, the longer the survey is, the less time respondents will spend on answering each question. Now, for surveys that are longer than 30 questions, the average amount of time that respondents spend on each question is nearly half of that compared to surveys with less than 30 questions. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the data quality is lower. It just means you need to be mindful of how many questions you ask, because you're putting an extra burden on participants, and it also means they're less reflective of the responses that they give. It's also important to note that dropout rates increase for surveys that take longer than 7 to 8 minutes. And so we would recommend that the ideal survey length is about that 7 to 10 minutes, maybe up to 15, but probably you don't want to go too much longer than that. However, I just want to add, I suppose, that keep in mind that this advice really does depend on the topic and on your audience. If your audience is really engaged in the content and you have a close relationship with them, and maybe they're invested in the outcome of the survey, then their tolerance for a lengthier survey is higher. It's also sometimes important to recognise that depth of information is important to some studies. And if your respondents are prepared to answer more questions, it can improve the value of the data you collect. So you do really have to assess it based on your audience. Okay, so once you've written your questionnaire, you're ready to program the survey in some software, get it ready for distribution. Now, there are several online survey tools that can help organisations create surveys, and we've just pulled out some of the most popular survey tools used by organisations. Well, each of them will have their unique pros and cons. Some are more expensive than others, some have more features. They all have the capability to program a survey and launch it to your distribution list and to collect data from your respondents with ease. Just to go through a few of the pros and cons of some of these at a general level, not talking about any of them specifically, it's just good to keep in mind the disadvantages and advantages of those do-it-yourself survey tools. And firstly, I suppose the main advantage is most of them are pretty cost efficient. There are some very expensive ones, and even some of the ones on that list, but most of them are cost efficient. There is a free trial with limited features available with most of them, and with some of them, the paid versions of the software are also quite reasonable. They're generally pretty easy to use. The user interface is clear, it's reasonably straightforward to program and also to distribute your surveys. And considering the cost, most of the survey software has some great features, including things like recording of real-time results. So as soon as your results come in, your responses come in, you can check your results. You can have custom branding, so you can add your logo or any other branding elements. You have customizable survey links that you can embed in your e-newsletters or on social media. And there's usually easy and simple reporting so that you can see your results. And finally, there is generally customer service and support, and most of them have a pretty good help section on their website with some, frequently asked questions and that type of thing to help you with building the survey. There are also some disadvantages though, and while I mentioned that they all do come with reporting tools, they're generally quite limited. They provide overview of your results, which are fairly basic. They focus on one question at a time. And if you wanted to conduct a more detailed analysis, then you'd need to download the data and perform that separately. Secondly, there is customer service and support available. However, that usually gives you help with the technical aspects of building the survey and the software. You still need to understand the basics of how to construct your survey and the best way to administer it to your participants. Thirdly, the free versions sometimes have limited features, so some of those things like maybe branding elements won't be available on your free survey, and to get those full benefits you'll have to take up a paid version. And finally, again, with customer service, sometimes real-time customer service might be difficult depending on where their head office is located. A lot of these programs are American, and so you might not get assistance when you need it simply because of the difference in time zones. Okay, so once you've chosen your software, then you can start, you'll need to program it in your software. And really there are three main steps that you will go through to do that. The first is you'll load your questions. Then you'll add any program logic or survey logic that you need to put in. And then you'll go through and test your survey. So firstly, as I said, the first step is to load your questionnaire into the software. And usually you'll have written your questionnaire in Word or something similar, and it's quite easy in most software just to then take that and type or copy and paste the questions into the software. The only thing I'd point out here is just make sure that you pay attention to the question type when you're setting it up and putting it in. You don't accidentally program a single option question to allow multiple response options. I'm sure we've all had that situation where you've been offered a question that asks you how old you are or what gender you are, and you're able to select multiple responses when obviously that's not the case. It's really very easy in most of these programs to select the right option, so just pay attention to it. Sometimes you also want to apply some programming rules or logic to your survey. And these are really just, what I mean by that is they're rules that determine which questions particular respondents should answer. Now, you can't really do this in paper surveys so much, except with instructions, which many people will ignore. But also survey software comes with a range of tools that help you apply these rules so that it happens automatically in the background. And it makes it easier for your participants to go through the survey without being presented with questions that are not relevant to them. There's lots of different logic rules that you can add. However, just to go through the few most common and the most important ones, I think, we'll just touch on a couple of examples. We've got questionnaire skip logic, which allows respondents to skip to a future question or page in the survey based on their answer to a previous question. There's option randomization, which randomizes the options for each question to minimize question order bias, which I'll talk about in a minute. And also you need to decide whether to make the questions compulsory for every respondent to answer. So let's just go through a quick example of each. So the first one, an example of the questionnaire skip logic. So in this question, the respondent is faced with about recommendation where they need to answer between 0 to 10, how likely they are to recommend volunteering at your organisation. Now, if they answer between 0 to 6, they're presented with a subsequent question which says, how could we improve? However, if they answer between 9 and 10, they're presented with a different question, which is, what did you enjoy most about your volunteering experience? So that just allows you to customise what is the next question that people see based on their previous response. And you can do that for a range of different questions. Another tool that you can use is option randomisation. And the reason that we do this is to reduce order bias. And by that I mean respondents might only pay attention to the first few statements and then they tune out and they don't read the other statements properly. So for example, we've got a list of options here, a question with some options, and both of those lists are the same. They're just presented in different order. The reason we do this is because sometimes they might only see the first couple and then miss the next, so, not read the bottom of the list. And so each person sees a different order list, so everyone's not just selecting the same things. Just one thing to point out here, it's always best to keep any other and don't know options fixed at the bottom of the list, and not to randomise these. And this is something that you can easily do in your survey software. Finally, as I said, you need to decide whether your questions need to be compulsory or not. And that's something that we're often asked about, and sometimes it's something that we struggle with as we're designing our own questionnaires. Because while it might seem sensible to make it compulsory for every respondent to answer every question, you need to think again. If you force participants to answer every single question, you may end up with fewer responses and you may end up with inaccurate data. So what you need to do is think about which questions are appropriate to make compulsory. So for example, there's no point making it compulsory for someone to answer the question, how many children do you have? If they don't have children, they can't answer that question. Another thing we always suggest is it's best not to make personal questions compulsory so that they can skip that answer if they'd prefer to keep it private. For example, it's common practice not to make it compulsory to provide your personal income. If you do decide to make all the questions compulsory, what I would suggest is it's always a good idea to add a don't know or a prefer not to answer option. And that prevents them dropping out because it gives respondents something they can select and then move on. Okay, so you're up to the last step in your survey design stage, and that is to do your testing. This is a really important step in detecting any errors that you may have missed when you're constructing your survey. Now, what we recommend is that you would test your survey both internally and externally for grammar, question clarity, the logic's working, things like that, spelling mistakes, all types of little errors that you might have picked up. The other thing that it's a good practice to do is to test your survey on different devices, so on a laptop as well as smartphones, and also on different browsers such as Google Chrome, Safari, Explorer, Firefox, just to make sure it's working in all of those different environments, because all of your respondents will be using different devices and different browser software. If you're conducting a paper survey, hand out a few copies to your stakeholders and a small group of potential respondents for their feedback. Just make sure they understand the questions and how they need to answer. And when your survey looks good, I just conduct a quick pilot launch of your survey. And what I mean by that is that you just send out the survey to a small group of people, 5 to 10, maybe 20, just so you can check the data that's collected. And this is just a safety measure to make sure that the survey platform is collecting the information and responses correctly. Once you've done that, you've conducted all of your checks, there's nothing left to do except launch your survey and send it out to your entire database. So that concludes our video on good questionnaire and survey design practice, which hopefully gives you a good guide of the key things you need to be thinking about when putting your survey together and programming it in your software. As I said, there are 6 videos that provide more information, and the next one will move on to fieldwork and response management. So you can assess all of the things you need to do while your survey's out in the field to make sure you've got an adequate sample and you're maximising your response rates. If you have any questions, we're available by phone or email, so please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We're more than happy to have a chat and answer any questions that you might have. Thanks for watching.